It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
"Give me the keys, Arthur," Julian Sterling snapped, his voice cutting through the crisp mountain air like a jagged blade. "You don't look like you belong in a car like this anyway." He stood on the heated cobblestone driveway of the Silver Peak Lodge, his hand outstretched with an entitlement that seemed to vibrate in the sub-zero temperature. Behind him, the jagged peaks of the Swiss Alps pierced a violet sky, but Julian's eyes were fixed solely on the vintage keys dangling from his father's hand. Arthur Sterling didn't flinch. He adjusted the collar of his worn wool coat, a garment that had seen more winters than Julian had seen boardrooms. The silence between them was heavy, muffled by the surrounding snow, until the heavy oak doors of the lodge swung open. Vanessa Sterling stepped out, wrapped in a fur coat that likely cost more than a modest suburban home. She didn't walk. She glided, the scent of her cloying midnight jasmine perfume preceding her like a floral warning. She leaned into Julian's side, her eyes raking over Arthur with a pity that felt like a physical slap. "Oh, Julian, don't be so harsh," she cooed, though her gaze remained cold. "He's just confused. The altitude does strange things to people of a certain vintage." Perhaps he thought the Bentley was the shuttle to the staff quarters. A few yards away, a small group of socialites paused their conversation, their breath hitching in the frigid air. Among them was Silas Thorne, a man whose tailored suit was as sharp as his legal mind. He watched the exchange with an unreadable expression, his gloved fingers tapping rhythmically against a leather briefcase. Beside him stood Mrs. Gable, the lodge's longest-tenured resident, her sharp eyes darting between the aging engineer and his arrogant son. Julian chuckled, the sound hollow and sharp. The staff quarters might be an upgrade for him, Vanessa. He spent so many years buried in blueprints and dirt that he's forgotten what real luxury feels like. He stepped closer to Arthur, invading his personal space. "The car, Arthur, now. I have a dinner at the summit, and I won't be seen arriving in a taxi because you wanted to play chauffeur one last time." Arthur looked down at the keys. They were cold, the silver logo of the Bentley pressing into his palm. He could feel the weight of the secret he carried, the fact that the very lodge they stood in, the very mountain air they breathed, and the very car Julian coveted were all held together by the quiet strength of his own legacy. He wasn't just a retired engineer. He was the architect of the firm Julian was currently running into the ground. "The car is temperamental in this weather, Julian," Arthur said, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded the space without raising its volume. "It requires a certain touch, a respect for the machinery." Julian's face flushed a deep, angry red. "Respect. I'm the CEO of Sterling Structural. I think I can handle a gear shift. You're just a relic, Arthur, a ghost haunting his own house. Now give me the keys before I have security escort you to the gate." Vanessa let out a sharp, tinkling laugh. "He's right, dear. It's embarrassing, really. Look at your shoes, they're scuffed. People are starting to stare." Arthur glanced at his boots. They were scuffed because he had spent the morning in the lodge's basement, inspecting a hairline fracture in the primary support column that no one else had noticed. He knew exactly how much pressure that stone could take before the entire terrace they were standing on collapsed into the valley below. He knew the structural integrity of their lives better than they did. "Fine," Arthur said softly. He dropped the keys into Julian's open palm. The metal clinked, a small, final sound against the backdrop of the vast, silent mountains. Julian didn't say thank you. He simply turned on his heel, signaling for Vanessa to follow. "Try not to get lost on your way to the bus stop, Arthur. It's a long walk down." As the engine of the Bentley roared to life, a deep, guttural purr that echoed off the granite cliffs, Arthur reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, encrypted mobile phone. He didn't look at the car as it sped away, tires crunching over the light dusting of snow. Instead, he looked at the stone mantle of the lodge, tracing the invisible lines of stress he knew were there. Silas Thorne stepped forward, his boots crunching softly on the ice. He stood beside Arthur, his gaze following the disappearing taillights. "He has no idea, does he?" Silas asked, his voice barely a whisper. None, Arthur replied. He tapped a command into the phone, a sequence that opened a secure line to a contact labeled Marcus. He thinks the world is made of glass because he's never had to build anything from the ground up. And the files? Silas asked, gesturing to his briefcase. Arthur checked his watch. The sun was dipping below the peaks, casting long, skeletal shadows across the driveway. Keep them close, Silas. The board meeting is in 48 hours. Julian wants to talk about trimming the fat. I think it's time we showed him exactly what happens when you remove the foundation. Arthur turned away from the lodge, walking toward the small, unassuming SUV parked in the shadows of the pine trees. He didn't look back at the luxury he had created. He was looking forward to the silence that was about to follow. "Call Detective Marcus," Arthur said into the phone as he climbed into the driver's seat. "Tell her the audit is complete. We start tomorrow." He pulled out of the driveway, leaving the Silver Peak Lodge behind. In his rearview mirror, the lights of the gala flickered like dying stars. Julian thought he had won the car, but Arthur knew the truth. The car was just a machine. The real power was in the silence of the Alps, waiting for the first crack to show. The next morning, the silence of the guest house was shattered by the rhythmic, aggressive screech of packing tape. Arthur Sterling stood in the doorway of his small study, his face a mask of practiced calm, as he watched two movers haul his vintage drafting table toward the exit. Julian Sterling stood in the center of the room, looking vastly out of place in a tailored Italian suit that cost more than the movers' annual salaries. He was scrolling through his phone, a smirk playing on his lips as he directed the chaos with casual waves of his hand. Vanessa Sterling stood beside him, draped in a silk wrap that smelled cloyingly of lilies and expensive gin. She was pointing at the empty corner where Arthur's late wife's armchair had once sat. "It's about the aesthetic, Arthur," Julian said, not looking up from his screen. "This space is wasted on old blueprints and dust. Vanessa needs a proper studio for her wellness brand. You understand, don't you? Family helps family." Arthur's gaze drifted to a cardboard box near the door. Protruding from the top was a framed photograph of his wife, the glass cracked across her smiling face. His pulse hammered a steady, cold rhythm against his ribs, but he didn't raise his voice. He reached down and picked up a brass drafting compass that had rolled onto the hardwood. The metal was cold, a familiar weight in his palm. "I wasn't aware the guest house was included in your restructuring of the estate," Arthur said quietly. Julian finally looked up, his eyes cold and brimming with the unearned confidence of a man who had never known a day of true labor. "Everything on this mountain is Sterling property, and since I'm the CEO of Sterling Developments, that makes it my call. You're lucky I'm letting you move into the caretaker's cottage by the north gate. It's rustic, very you." Vanessa let out a sharp, brittle laugh. "It's practically a shed, Julian, don't be cruel." She turned to Arthur, her smile not reaching her eyes. "We're doing you a favor, really. All this clutter can't be good for your head. You've been so stagnant since the retirement." Arthur tucked the compass into his pocket. He glanced out the window and saw Mrs. Gable standing on her porch across the lane, her arms crossed, watching the movers with a look of profound disapproval. She knew. The whole neighborhood was watching the son treat the father like a tenant he was trying to evict. "The board meeting is tomorrow, Julian," Arthur said, his voice as steady as a structural beam. "The audit results will be presented. Are you sure you want to spend your energy moving furniture today?" Julian's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before the mask of arrogance slammed back into place. "The audit is a formality. Silas Thorne is a dinosaur, just like you. He'll bark, but he has no teeth. I've already secured the votes to finalize the trimming of the legacy accounts." "The legacy accounts," Arthur repeated. He thought of the secret accounts Julian didn't know existed, the ones that actually held the titles to the land the lodge sat on. Julian thought he was trimming fat. He didn't realize he was cutting the very cables holding up his gilded world. "Exactly," Julian snapped, turning back to his phone. "Now, clear out. The decorators will be here by noon." Arthur turned and walked out without another word. He didn't head for the caretaker's cottage. Instead, he walked toward the SUV parked in the shadows. Once inside, he pulled out his phone. He had recorded the entire exchange, the audio crisp and clear. He dialed a number. Sela's Thorne answered on the first ring. "The audit is live," Arthur said, watching in the rearview mirror as Julian stepped onto the porch, gesturing wildly at the movers. "He just confirmed on tape that he intends to liquidate the legacy accounts. He thinks the Sterling Trust is a bank account. He still doesn't realize it's a holding company." "And the signatures?" Sela's asked. "He signed the eviction notice for the guest house this morning," Arthur said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "He used the corporate seal. He just legally admitted to exercising executive authority over assets he doesn't own. It's the final piece Detective Marcus needed." 24 hours, Arthur," Sela's said. "The board gathers at 10. Julian thinks he's giving a victory speech." "Let him prepare," Arthur said, his eyes fixed on the cracked photo of his wife sitting atop the trash pile. "The higher he builds his pedestal, the further he has to fall." He put the car in gear. He had one more stop to make before the sun went down. Mrs. Gable was still watching from her porch. As Arthur drove past, he gave her a single, sharp nod. The witness was ready. The evidence was secured. The countdown had begun. 2 days later, the morning sun crawled over the city skyline, but the light inside Sela's Thorne's office remained dim and focused. The air smelled of expensive leather and the sharp, chemical tang of a high-end laser printer. Sela's sat behind his mahogany desk, his fingers tapping rhythmically against a thick manila folder. He looked up as Arthur Sterling entered, his expression a mix of professional triumph and personal satisfaction. "It's done, Arthur," Sela's said, his voice low. He slid the folder across the desk. Arthur reached out, his calloused fingers grazing the cool, heavy paper. He pulled out the document. It was a certified copy of the original 1984 Articles of Incorporation for the Sterling Trust, bearing a fresh, raised gold seal from the county archives. He traced the lines of text he had written decades ago, his eyes lingering on the specific clause in Section 4C. It was the sleeping lion provision, a legal fail-safe that stripped all executive authority from any trustee who attempted to liquidate core assets without the founder's physical signature. "Julian thinks the trust is just a bank account he can drain," Sela's remarked, leaning back in his chair. "He doesn't realize it's the legal skin of the entire company. By signing those eviction notices with the corporate seal yesterday, he didn't just kick you out of the guest house. He triggered the unauthorized governance clause. He's essentially handed us the keys to his own handcuffs." "And Detective Alina Marcus?" Arthur asked, his voice steady. "She's seen the digital trail," Sela's confirmed. "She's waiting for the physical evidence to be presented in a formal setting. She told me this morning that the moment Julian stands up to claim ownership of the Sterling assets at the board meeting, he's committing a felony in real time. We don't just have him for the money, Arthur. We have him for the fraud." Arthur nodded, the weight of the document in his hand feeling like a loaded weapon. "One more stop," he murmured. "I need to collect the rest of my things from the estate." An hour later, Arthur pulled his modest sedan into the circular driveway of the Sterling mansion. The sight that met him was a calculated insult. 3 professional movers were hauling crates out of the side entrance, while Julian Sterling stood on the marble portico, a hand-rolled cigar clamped between his teeth. He was dressed in a tailored silk suit that cost more than Arthur's car, looking every bit the conquering king. Vanessa Sterling stood beside him, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, a glass of chilled Chardonnay in her hand despite the early hour. "You're late, Uncle," Julian called out, his voice dripping with mock pity. He didn't move to help. Instead, he watched with an amused smirk as a mover struggled with a heavy wooden crate. "I told the boys to be careful, but honestly, most of this junk belongs in a museum or a dumpster." Vanessa let out a sharp, melodic laugh. The smell of her cloying lily perfume drifted toward Arthur on the breeze. "Really, Arthur, it's for the best. This house needs a modern touch. All these dusty old engineering blueprints and heavy tools, they're so depressing. We're turning your old study into a climate-controlled wine cellar." Arthur didn't flinch. He walked toward the crates, his boots echoing on the stone. As he passed Julian, the younger man stepped forward, intentionally blocking his path. Julian blew a cloud of acrid smoke into the air, the gray haze swirling between them. "I'm feeling generous today," Julian sneered, reaching into his inner pocket. He pulled out a checkbook and scribbled a figure with a gold-plated pen. He ripped the check off and held it out between two fingers. $5,000. Think of it as a retirement bonus. Take it, buy yourself a nice little condo in the suburbs and stay out of my way. If you show up at the board meeting tomorrow, I'll have security toss you into the street. I'm the chairman now. I've earned this. Arthur looked at the check, then up at Julian's eyes filled with an arrogance so profound it was almost blinding. Two of the movers paused, watching the exchange with awkward downward glances. Mrs. Gable, Arthur's neighbor from the guest house, was visible through the iron gates, her hands gripped tightly on her garden shears as she witnessed the humiliation. "You haven't earned anything, Julian," Arthur said quietly. He didn't take the check. Instead, he reached out and adjusted Julian's silk tie, a gesture that looked paternal but felt like a threat. "You've only borrowed it, and the interest is coming due." Julian's face flushed a deep, angry red. He crumpled the check and threw it at Arthur's chest. "Get your trash and get out. You're a ghost, Arthur, a relic." "Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, I'm signing the merger with the Davenport Group, and the Sterling name will finally mean something besides old man in a dusty workshop." 10 o'clock, Arthur repeated, his voice a calm whisper. He picked up the last crate, the one containing his old brass compass set and the original hand-drawn plans for the city's main bridge. He felt the cold, familiar weight of the metal through the wood. He turned and walked back to his car without looking back. Behind him, he heard Julian laughing, a loud, jagged sound that echoed off the limestone walls of the house he didn't truly own. Vanessa's voice followed, complaining about the scuff marks the movers were leaving on the floor. As Arthur drove away, he glanced at the passenger seat where the manila folder lay. He could almost feel the countdown ticking in his chest. 24 hours. The board members were already arriving in the city, checking into their luxury hotels, expecting a victory celebration. Julian was likely ordering the finest champagne, oblivious to the fact that the very documents he intended to sign tomorrow were the ones that would dismantle his life. Arthur pulled over a block away and dialed a number. "Detective Elena Marcus," the voice answered. "It's Arthur Sterling," he said, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, watching the gates of the estate shrink in the distance. "The witness is ready. The documents are in hand. I'll see you at the board meeting tomorrow morning." "We'll be there, Mr. Sterling," she replied. "Make sure he speaks first. We need him on the record." Arthur ended the call. He reached into the crate and pulled out his old compass, the brass polished to a dull shine. He held it steady as the car idled. The needle flickered, searching for true north before locking into place. Everything was aligned. The higher Julian built his pedestal, the more spectacular the collapse would be. Arthur put the car in gear, his face a mask of stone. The countdown had reached its final cycle. Tomorrow, the lion would stop sleeping. The evening before the board meeting, the air in Silas Thorne's private study was thick with the scent of aged mahogany and the sharp, clinical smell of fresh ink. Silas sat behind a desk that looked like it belonged in a museum, his fingers drumming a rhythmic, predatory beat against a thick stack of affidavits. He looked up as Arthur Sterling entered, his eyes sharp behind silver-rimmed spectacles. "Everything is verified," Silas said, his voice a low gravel. He slid a heavy, ivory-colored envelope across the polished wood. "The structural patents, the original land grant, and the offshore accounts Julian used to siphon the maintenance funds. It's all here. The paper trail is a straight line to his front door." Arthur reached out, his calloused fingers tracing the embossed seal on the envelope. The paper felt heavy, a physical manifestation of decades of silent labor. "He thinks tomorrow is his coronation," he murmured. "He's already celebrating," Silas replied, leaning back. He tapped a button on his desk console, playing a recorded voicemail from 2 hours ago. Julian's voice filled the room, loud and slurred with expensive bourbon. "Silas, tell my dear uncle not to bother showing up tomorrow. I've got the board in my pocket. Tell him to take whatever pride he has left and crawl back to that dusty apartment. Vanessa and I are already picking out the new upholstery for his old office." In the background, Vanessa Sterling's high-pitched laugh rang out, followed by the distinct clink of crystal. "He's a ghost, Silas. A relic. Tell him to stay dead." The recording cut off. The silence that followed was heavy. Arthur didn't flinch. He simply felt the cold weight of the brass compass in his pocket, a grounding anchor against the storm of Julian's arrogance. "He still doesn't see it," Arthur said quietly. "He looks at me and sees a man who lost everything, never realizing I'm the one who gave it to him in the first place." "Arrogance is a blindfold," Silas agreed. "He's so focused on the crown that he hasn't noticed the floorboards are rotting beneath his feet." Arthur picked up his phone. He had one final task before the morning. He dialed a number he knew by heart. It rang 3 times before Julian Sterling answered, the sound of a bustling, high-end restaurant audible in the background. "I told Silas to tell you to stay home, Arthur," Julian snapped, his voice dripping with dismissive contempt. "Are you calling to beg for a pension? Because I might find a few pennies in the couch cushions if you ask nicely." "I'm calling to give you a choice, Julian," Arthur said, his voice as steady as a mountain. "Cancel the meeting. Step down quietly. Return the funds you took from the structural integrity reserves, and I'll let you walk away with your name intact." There was a beat of silence, then a burst of incredulous laughter. "You'll let me? You're a retired engineer with a pension and a hobby kit, Arthur. I am the face of this legacy. I've already signed the contracts. Tomorrow, I don't just lead this company, I own it. Stay in your lane, old man, before you get run over." "I've spent my life studying foundations, Julian," Arthur said, his eyes fixed on the ivory envelope. "I know exactly what happens when the load exceeds the support. This is your last chance to step off the ledge." "The only thing falling tomorrow is your ego," Julian sneered. The line went dead. Arthur set the phone down. He felt no anger, only a profound, cold clarity. He turned to Silas, who was watching him with a grim smile. "He took the bait," Silas noted. "He didn't even see the hook," Arthur replied. He stood up, the ivory envelope tucked securely under his arm. The countdown had shifted from days to hours. As he walked out into the cool night air, the city lights shimmering like distant diamonds, Arthur felt the vibration of a text message. It was from Detective Alina Marcus. "The forensic accountants have finished the cross-reference. We have him on 3 counts of racketeering and grand larceny. See you at 9:00 a.m. Arthur looked up at the towering Sterling headquarters, the glass facade reflecting the moonlight. Tomorrow, the building would remain, but the man inside would crumble. He turned toward his car, his shadow long and sharp against the pavement. The lion had finished its rest. Tomorrow, the world would hear it roar. The evening of the Sterling Legacy Gala arrived with a clinical, polished perfection that only extreme wealth could buy. The grand ballroom of the plaza was a cathedral of gold leaf and mirrored walls, reflecting the shimmering gowns and sharp tuxedos of the city's elite. The air was thick with the scent of white lilies and the smoky undertone of expensive bourbon, a combination that usually signaled a night of triumph. Arthur Sterling stepped through the arched mahogany doors at exactly 8 o'clock. He wore a charcoal wool suit, perfectly tailored, but devoid of the flashy labels favored by the younger crowd. His presence was quiet, almost invisible against the backdrop of the string quartet's soaring Vivaldi. He felt the weight of the ivory envelope tucked into his inner breast pocket, a physical anchor in a room full of ghosts. At the center of the room, Julian Sterling was holding court. He stood beneath a massive crystal chandelier, the light catching the diamond-encrusted face of his watch as he gestured wildly with a champagne flute. Vanessa Sterling stood at his side, her smile as fixed and glittering as the emeralds around her neck. They were surrounded by a circle of board members and socialites, all leaning in as Julian spun a tale of his supposed brilliance in the recent market shift. "It's about vision," Julian's voice carried over the music, dripping with a self-assurance he hadn't earned. Some people are content to sit on what they have until it rots. I prefer to build, to expand, to take what is stagnant and make it breathe again. Arthur watched from the periphery. He saw Silas Thorne standing near the bar, his sharp eyes meeting Arthur's for a fraction of a second. Silas gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The trap was set, the steel jaws hidden beneath the velvet of the evening's festivities. Julian spotted him then. His expression shifted from triumphant to derisive in a heartbeat. He whispered something to Vanessa, who let out a sharp, tinkling laugh before they both began weaving through the crowd toward him. "Arthur," Julian said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of a nearby group of investors. "I'm surprised you found the place. I thought you'd be tucked away in that dusty little house of yours, counting your pennies." "The invitation was quite clear about the time and location, Julian," Arthur replied, his voice a calm contrast to his nephew's jagged energy. Vanessa leaned in, the cloying scent of her perfume hitting Arthur like a physical blow. "We were just saying how brave it is for you to show up in that vintage ensemble. It really highlights the difference between the old guard and the new, doesn't it?" Julian smirked, stepping closer into Arthur's personal space. He reached out, flicking a non-existent speck of dust from Arthur's lapel. "You don't belong here anymore, Uncle. This room, this company, this legacy, it's moved past you. You're just a footnote now, a reminder of a slower, smaller time." Arthur didn't flinch. He let the insult hang in the air, allowing the surrounding witnesses, the CFO, a prominent real estate mogul, and 2 senior board members, to absorb Julian's cruelty. He felt a cold, sharp clarity. "A footnote can sometimes change the entire meaning of a page, Julian. You'd know that if you ever bothered to read the contracts you sign." Julian's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He opened his mouth to deliver another blow, but he was interrupted by the arrival of a waiter carrying a tray of appetizers. Julian swiped a glass of champagne from the tray, nearly knocking it over in his haste. "Don't talk to me about contracts," Julian hissed, leaning in so close that Arthur could smell the alcohol on his breath. "I've spent the last 6 months cleaning up your messes. Tomorrow, when I'm officially named chairman for life, I'm going to make sure your name is scrubbed from every hall in Sterling headquarters. You'll be lucky if I let you keep your pension." "Is that so?" Arthur asked softly. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the cool, smooth paper of the envelope. "You seem very certain of tomorrow." "I am the future," Julian snapped. He turned to the crowd, raising his glass. "To the future." The surrounding guests echoed the toast, though Arthur noticed the way the CFO's eyes lingered on Julian with a flicker of doubt. Silas Thorne moved closer now, standing just behind Julian's shoulder like a silent sentinel. Across the room, near the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains, Arthur caught sight of Detective Alina Marcus. She wasn't in uniform, but her posture was unmistakable. She was watching Julian with the predatory patience of someone who already knew the ending of the story. Beside her stood Mrs. Gable, looking remarkably elegant in a navy gown, her eyes fixed on Julian with a look of profound disapproval. The atmosphere in the room was shifting. The initial celebratory buzz was being replaced by a heavy, pressurized anticipation. It was the feeling of a storm front moving in, the air growing still and electric before the first strike of lightning. Vanessa checked her diamond-studded watch. "It's time, Julian. The presentation is starting." Julian straightened his silk tie, his chest puffing out with unearned pride. "Right, the speech. The moment the world realizes who really runs this city." He looked back at Arthur one last time, his eyes full of a malicious glee. "Stay close, Uncle. I want you to have a front-row seat when I bury your era for good." He strode toward the small, flower-draped stage at the end of the ballroom, Vanessa trailing behind him like a loyal shadow. The lights in the ballroom began to dim, leaving only the bright, focused glow of the spotlights on the podium. Arthur moved toward the side of the stage, finding a position where he was visible to the entire room but remained in the half-light. Silas joined him, his face a mask of professional neutrality. "The digital files are queued," Silas whispered. The board has been given the physical copies under the guise of program notes. They're opening them now. Arthur looked out into the audience. He saw the confusion beginning to ripple through the front row. The board members weren't looking at the stage. They were staring down at the documents in their hands, their faces turning pale under the gala lights. Julian stepped up to the microphone. The feedback let out a sharp, piercing whine that silenced the room. He smiled, a wide, predatory grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice amplified and booming. "Tonight, we celebrate the end of the old sterling and the birth of something much, much greater." Arthur reached out and touched the control panel hidden behind the velvet curtain. His hand was steady. He looked at Julian, who was basking in the glow of the spotlight, completely unaware that the floor beneath him was already gone. "Go ahead, Julian," Arthur whispered to the empty air. "Tell them exactly who you are." The silence that followed Julian's boast was heavy, thick with the scent of overperfumed lilies and the metallic tang of expensive catering. He stood at the podium, his chest puffed out like a peacock, waiting for the applause that usually greeted his every word. Instead, the giant LED screen behind him hummed with a sudden, sharp static. The glossy rendering of the new sterling luxury towers vanished, replaced by a jagged, scanned document that bore the official red stamp of a structural failure. Julian's smile didn't just fade, it curdled. He clicked the remote in his hand, his thumb pressing so hard the plastic creaked, but the image remained. It was a memo dated 3 months prior, detailing the deliberate use of substandard concrete in the foundation of his flagship project. Below it, a series of wire transfers flickered into view, showing millions of dollars diverted from the safety budget into a shell company registered in his wife's maiden name. The room, filled with the city's most influential investors, went deathly quiet. Julian's eyes didn't just widen, they seemed to bulge, the pupils shrinking to pinpricks against the sudden, harsh glare of the projector. The smug, practiced curve of his mouth dissolved into a jagged, trembling line, his lower lip twitching uncontrollably as the blood fled his face, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. A bead of sweat broke from his hairline, tracing a slow, glistening path through his expensive foundation, while his throat worked in a series of dry, clicking swallows that the microphone caught and broadcasted to the horrified crowd. He looked less like a CEO and more like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had been shut for hours. "There must be a technical glitch," he stammered, his voice cracking, a pathetic shadow of the booming baritone he had used moments ago. He turned toward the wings, his eyes darting frantically for a technician to blame. Vanessa Sterling, who had been standing at the foot of the stage ready to join him, took a sharp, instinctive step back. Her hand flew to the emerald necklace Julian had bought her with those stolen funds, her fingers digging into her own skin. She didn't look at him with sympathy. She looked at him with the cold, calculating horror of a woman watching a sinking ship she was currently standing on. She turned her head away, physically distancing herself as the board members in the front row began to rise, their faces twisted in fury. Silas Thorne stepped into the light at the edge of the stage, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't say a word, but the grim nod he gave to the back of the room signaled the next phase. From the shadows of the third row, Detective Alina Marcus stood up. The light caught the silver of her badge as she moved toward the stage with the slow, deliberate pace of inevitable justice. Arthur Sterling stepped out from behind the velvet curtain, his modest suit a sharp contrast to Julian's $5,000 tuxedo. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The hum of the projector was the only sound in the hall as he walked to the second microphone. "You always said I didn't understand the modern world, Julian," Arthur said, his voice calm and steady, carrying to the very back of the ballroom. "You said the Sterling name was a brand to be traded, not a promise to be kept. But a building is only as strong as its foundation. And yours was built on sand and theft." Julian reached out, his hand shaking as he tried to grab Arthur's arm, but Arthur stepped back with a look of quiet revulsion. "Don't," Arthur whispered, loud enough for the front row to hear. "The police are waiting in the foyer. Silas has the original ledgers, And Mrs. Gable, she's already given her statement about the night you tried to burn the evidence in my backyard." Julian collapsed against the podium, the wood groaning under his weight. He looked out at the sea of people who had once envied him, only to find a wall of cold, judging eyes. His empire hadn't just fallen, it had been dismantled, piece by piece, by the man he had dismissed as a relic. Arthur didn't stay to watch the handcuffs click shut. He turned and walked off the stage. The heavy velvet curtain muffled the sound of Julian's frantic, sobbing excuses. As he reached the exit, he paused, looking at the sterling logo on the glass doors one last time. He had saved the name, but the family was gone. He pushed the doors open and stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the chaos behind him. He had one more call to make, and the countdown to the final reckoning had already hit 0. The seconds stretched into an agonizing silence, thick with the smell of expensive lilies and the metallic tang of Julian's mounting terror. He remained frozen behind the mahogany podium, his fingers digging into the polished wood until his knuckles turned a ghostly white. The stage lights, once his spotlight of triumph, now felt like a heat lamp over a specimen. He looked out at the sea of faces, the board members, the investors, the elite of the city, and saw only a wall of cold, predatory curiosity. He tried to swallow, but his throat felt like it was lined with glass. "This is a misunderstanding," he croaked, his voice cracking in a way that stripped him of every ounce of manufactured authority. He looked toward the front row, searching for an ally, but found only the backs of heads as people shifted their chairs away from him. Detective Alina Marcus stepped forward from the shadows of the foyer. Her heels clicked against the marble floor with the rhythmic, lethal precision of a countdown. She didn't need to raise her voice to command the room. "Julian Sterling," she said, the name sounding like a sentence in the sudden stillness. "You are under arrest for grand larceny, racketeering, and the systematic embezzlement of the Sterling Trust." The room erupted in a low, frantic hum of whispers. Julian's face underwent a transformation that the guests would discuss for years. The bronze tan he'd cultivated on yachts seemed to evaporate, replaced by a sickly, translucent gray. A bead of sweat broke from his hairline and traced a jagged path through his makeup, carving a line of raw panic down his cheek. His lower lip began to tremble, a frantic, rhythmic twitch that he couldn't suppress no matter how hard he clamped his jaw. His eyes darted toward the side exit, wide and bloodshot, like a trapped animal realizing the cage had no floor. Vanessa Sterling didn't rush to his side. She stood several feet away, her silk gown rustling, a sound like a serpent sliding through dry grass. She adjusted the heavy diamond necklace Julian had bought her with stolen funds, her expression shifting from shock to a cold, sharpened mask of self-preservation. When Julian reached out a trembling hand toward her, she took a deliberate step back, her eyes narrowing with a flash of pure, unadulterated disgust. She wasn't losing a husband, she was discarding a liability. "Julian, how could you?" she breathed, her voice carrying just enough for the nearest witnesses to hear. It was a masterclass in betrayal, the enabler cutting ties before the first handcuff could even click. Sela's Thorn moved into the light beside the detective, clutching a leather-bound folder that contained the final nails for Julian's coffin. He looked at the man behind the podium with the detached pity one might afford a crushed insect. "The freeze on the accounts is already in effect, Julian," Sela said, his voice smooth and professional. "Every asset, every property, and every offshore shell company has been identified. You haven't just lost the company. You've lost everything down to the cufflinks you're wearing." The board chair, a man Julian had spent months patronizing, stood up with a face of thunder. "Security," he barked, gesturing toward the stage. "Get this man out of my sight." The face slap was no longer metaphorical. It was a physical collapse. Julian's knees buckled and he slid down the side of the podium, his expensive suit bunching up in ungraceful folds. He looked small. For the first time in his life, the arrogance had been stripped away, leaving behind a hollow, frightened boy who had played at being a king. As the officers moved in, the sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was the loudest noise in the ballroom. It was a sharp, mechanical finality. Julian didn't fight. He let them haul him to his feet, his head hanging low, his eyes fixed on the floor as he was paraded past the very people he had mocked only an hour before. Outside, the cool night air hit Arthur as he leaned against the side of his modest sedan. He pulled an old flip phone from his pocket, a device Julian had laughed at during their last dinner. He hit a speed dial button and waited. "It's done," Arthur said when the call connected. His voice was calm, devoid of the heat of revenge, carrying only the weight of a long-overdue justice. "The house is being cleared. The locks are being changed as we speak." He listened for a moment, his gaze fixed on the glass doors of the Sterling building. He saw the flashing blue and red lights reflecting off the logo, the name he had built, the name Julian had nearly destroyed. "No," Arthur replied to the voice on the other end. "Don't leave anything of his behind. If it was bought with my father's legacy, it stays with the estate. If it was Julian's, throw it on the curb." He ended the call and looked up at the moon. The weight that had sat on his chest for years was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. The lion wasn't just awake, he had finished the hunt. But as he watched the police cruiser pull away with his nephew in the back, Arthur knew the hardest part wasn't the reckoning itself. It was the silence that followed. He climbed into his car, the engine turning over with a reliable hum. He had one more stop to make, a quiet cemetery on the edge of town where a headstone had been waiting for this news for a very long time. As he pulled away from the curb, he didn't look back at the lights or the scandal. He drove into the dark, leaving the ruins of Julian's empire in his rearview mirror. 6 months had passed since the blue and red lights had faded from the driveway of the Sterling estate, taking the noise and the scandal with them. The morning air at the edge of the city was crisp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of freshly turned earth and pine sawdust. Arthur Sterling stood at the perimeter of the construction site, his boots caked in the same red clay he had spent 40 years navigating. He didn't wear a designer suit or a gold watch. He wore a weathered canvas jacket and held a set of blueprints that didn't belong to a mansion, but to a vocational center that would soon bear his father's name. The silence here was different from the heavy, suffocating quiet that had followed the reckoning. This was the silence of a beginning. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the gravel lot, and Silas Thorne stepped out. The lawyer looked as polished as ever, though he moved with less urgency than he had during the height of the litigation. He walked up to the older man, shielding his eyes from the rising sun. "The final receivership papers are signed," Silas said, handing over a slim leather folder. "It's officially over. The last of the luxury assets have been liquidated to the creditors. The penthouse, the cars, even the offshore accounts Julian Sterling tried to hide, everything is gone." Arthur didn't open the folder immediately. He watched a crane lift a steel beam into place. The rhythmic clanging of metal on metal was the only music he cared for now. And Julian. Silas leaned against the temporary fencing. He's adjusted poorly to his new reality. He's currently residing in a state-mandated transitional facility while he awaits the start of his sentence. I'm told he spent his first week complaining about the thread count of the sheets. He tried to pull the do-you-know-who-I-am routine on a floor supervisor. It didn't work. He's been assigned to the laundry detail. Arthur felt a ghost of a smile touch his lips, but it lacked malice. It was the cold satisfaction of a bridge finally being braced correctly. Julian Sterling, a man who had treated the world like his personal showroom, was now folding industrial towels in a room that smelled of bleach and failure. The image of his nephew's manicured hands submerged in soapy water was a quiet, proportional justice. "And Vanessa Sterling?" Arthur asked. "She filed for divorce the moment the frozen accounts were officially seized," Silas replied. "She tried to claim she was a victim of his financial coercion, but Detective Alina Marcus had already logged the recordings of her encouraging the embezzlement. She's living in a studio apartment in the city, working as a junior receptionist for a firm that used to court her for donations. They say she keeps her head down and refuses to look at the social columns." Arthur nodded slowly. He thought of the wine stain on his old shirt, the way Vanessa had looked at him like he was a smudge on her floor. Now, she was the one answering phones for people who knew exactly who she was and what she had done. The social ladder she had climbed so ruthlessly had turned into a slide. "You won, Arthur," Silas said softly. "The foundation is funded, the name is cleared, and the people who tried to bury you are gone." "I know," Arthur said. He turned away from the construction and looked toward the distant tree line. "But winning has a price, Silas. I look at these blueprints and I see my father's legacy, but I also see the empty chairs at my dinner table. I'm the last sterling left who can walk through the front door of a bank without a lawyer. It's a lonely kind of victory." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver coin, the first dollar his father had ever earned. He rubbed his thumb over the worn metal. The weight of it was a sensory anchor, reminding him of the grit required to build something that lasted. "Mrs. Gable called me yesterday," Arthur continued. "She wanted to know if I needed help planting the garden at the new house. She said the neighborhood feels lighter now that the glitter and noise have moved on." "She's right," Silas said. "The city has a short memory for scandals, but a long one for builders." Arthur looked back at the foundation of the vocational center. The concrete was curring, solid and gray under the morning light. He had lost his family's peace, his nephew's respect, and the quiet retirement he had once envisioned. But as he watched the workers move with purpose across the site, he knew the foundation was finally deep enough to hold. He handed the folder back to Silas without looking at the numbers inside. The money didn't matter. The revenge was complete. The lion wasn't just awake. He was building a den that no one would ever be able to shake again. "Tell the contractors to double-shift the framing," Arthur said, his voice steady and commanding. "I want the roof on before the first frost. My father waited long enough for this." As Silas drove away, Arthur Sterling stood alone in the red dirt, a man who had lost everything that was fake to save everything that was real. He turned his back on the city and walked toward the sound of the hammers, leaving the ruins of the Sterling name behind to build something better in its place.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.